Objection number 10. Quote, "But when rulers are in possession by the voice of the majority, have they not therefore a claim to conscientious obedience?" Unquote. To this I answer, nations as well as individuals are bound to act agreeably to the divine law. If their conduct is repugnant thereto, it can confer no right, nor establish any obligation. The act of a majority can never legitimate what God has prohibited under pain of his displeasure. If it could, then it would necessarily follow that all things usually called right or wrong are in themselves indifferent, that the Bible has no definite meaning in itself, but takes it altogether from the opinions of men, and so will equally authenticate two systems, though diametrically opposite to each other. Neither possession, therefore, nor majority can give a right in opposition to the divine law. Possession may vest in one, and the right in another, as is the case of Solomon and Adonijah in 1 Kings 1, verse 5. Both possession and majority may vest in one person, and the right in another, as in the case of David and Absalom in 2 Samuel 15, verse 10, and 2 Samuel 17, verse 14. The voice of the people is to be considered as the perceptive voice of God only when they act agreeable to this law. But when the contrary, it neither establishes right nor constitutes obligation. Hence in Hosea 8, verse 4, quote, "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not." Unquote. The charge here must necessarily respect the neglect of the precept. For none could be advanced to civil dignity without his providence. A sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his providential permission. Objection number 11. Quote, "The restraint and punishment of idolaters, blasphemers, and gross heretics, which you contend for, belong to the Jewish theocracy, which was typical, and so ought not to be imitated." Unquote. Answer. This objection is extremely popular and deserves minute attention. It cannot be better answered than in the words of the late Reverend John Brown, minister of the seceding church in Haddington, North Britain, in his treatise on toleration, page 57. He defies his antagonist to prove that these instances of the restraint and punishment of idolatry, etc., by the Jewish rulers were merely typical. He goes on to observe thus, quote, "The typical magistrates of the Jewish nation also exercised laws relative to murder, theft, unchastity, treason, and other matters of the second table of the law." Unquote. Ought therefore no magistrate now to do so? The laws respecting the duties of the second table pertain as much to the Jewish theocracy as those relating to the first. Must therefore the Christian magistrate, for fear of copying the Jewish theocracy, meddle with no morality at all? Must everything that was once typical be now, under the gospel, excluded from regulating authority? Must all the excellent patterns of Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Job, Moses, Aaron, Samuel, David, and other Hebrew saints be rejected as typical and useless? Must all the laws directing to elect men fearing God and hating covetousness to be magistrates, or directing men to judge justly and impartially and prudently, and to punish murderers, adulterers, thieves, robbers, etc., be discarded as typical? Must the weekly Sabbath, public fasts, and thanksgivings be laid aside as typical, a mere sign between God and the Israelites? Must the Ten Commandments and all the explications of them in the Old Testament be discarded as published in a typical manner and to a typical people, and used as the principal part of their rule of government in the Jewish theocracy? As the Jewish church was a real church and not merely typical, so their state was a real commonwealth or kingdom and not merely typical. Whatever therefore pertained to it as a real commonwealth is imitable in any other. The Jewish church and state were as really distinct as the church and state are now, though I do not say precisely in the same manner." Unquote. This learned and pious author proceeds to show wherein they were distinct, which he does in 10 different particulars, which would be too tedious to detail here. Those who would desire to see this subject largely and judiciously investigated will find it in the first part of Gillespie's Aaron's Rod Blossoming, Book 1, chapters 1, 2, and 3. Mr. Brown still farther shows wherein the Jewish and the Christian magistrate agree. This he does in the 14 different particulars, which the inquisitive reader will find in the 60th, 61st, and 62nd pages of the treatise cited above. Objection number 12. Quote, Your principles are contrary to the 4th section of the 23rd article of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which teaches that infidelity or difference in religion does not make void the magistrate's just and legal authority, nor free the people from their due obedience to him." Unquote. Answer. The sense in which the General Assembly, as also the current of reformers and martyrs of the 17th century, understood this passage is fully stated in our testimony, as also in the letter from Stirling by Rev. John Macmillan. They distinguished between reformed and enlightened lands, and those that were unreformed and unenlightened. In the latter, many things may be borne with which ought not to be suffered in the former, particularly when by a solemn national act they have made scriptural qualifications essential to the civil constitution. This our ancestors did in their covenants, national and solemn league. All ranks and conditions in the realm solemnly swore to use every lawful endeavor to extirpate popery, prelacy, etc. It might have been inquired, would swearing allegiance to a constitution, afterwards erected upon the ruins of this, of which the support and establishment of any of these abhorred abominations was made an essential part, have been a means well calculated to promote the intention of their oath? This was exactly the situation of the lands of our nativity. Prelacy, which had been nationally abjured, was made essential to the British Constitution, and the King solemnly swore, in his coronation oath, to support it. Were not these two oaths, that is, one to extirpate prelacy and another to support it, flatly contradictory? To swear the latter is a declaring the former unobligatory, and consequently criminal when originally entered into. Can any one professing friendship to the Reformation of these times thus barefacedly pronounce its sentence of condemnation? Let the authority of the magistrate be just and legal. We will then hold ourselves conscientiously bound to yield obedience. No authority can be just and legal with which a contradiction to the moral law is essentially incorporated. Simple infidelity will not render it unjust, either in a heathen country or in one emerging from pagan darkness. Neither will simple difference in religion make it void, when the nation have, not by their own solemn act and deed, made conformity an essential article of their constitution. There may be many defects in a civil constitution, and yet it is morally binding upon a nation. And where plain immorality or a solemn obligation to support what the legislator of the universe prohibits under the severest penalties is essentially incorporated therewith, it cannot bind the conscience. Objection number 13. Quote, "Your principles lead to persecution and are cruel and unmerciful." Unquote. Answer. The Church of Christ never persecuted. If our principles lead to it, they are certainly wrong. But what is persecution? Does it consist in executing God's law? If it does, he must be the author of it. Does it not rather consist in injuring men in their characters, property, or persons for their tenacious and steadfast adherence to his divine commands? If this is not persecution, then the martyrs have suffered not for the cause and testimony of Jesus, but for their obstinate rebellion against it. How does this correspond with the character of those souls whom John saw lying under the altar, quote, "who were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held," Revelation 6, verse 9. Whosoever the law of God commands to be punished ought to be punished, with the penalties therein made and provided. But God has commanded gross heretics, blasphemers, and idolaters to be punished with certain specified penalties. Therefore, such ought to be punished. These commands could not belong to the ceremonial law, for then they would have flowed entirely from the arbitrary will of God and been mere signs between him and Israel. Who would dare to think so of gross heresy, etc.? Neither could they belong to that part of the judicial law which respected the Jews peculiarly. Who would dare to say that none but the Jews were or are under obligation to worship God in purity, or abstain from blaspheming his name and dignity? They must therefore belong to the moral law, and flow from the moral nature of Jehovah, who has declared he will not give his glory to another, nor his praise to graven images. Thus we find the first, second, and third precepts of the moral law pointedly prohibiting these things, and requiring the contrary duties. All the precepts and threatenings which are to be found respecting these scattered up and down the Bible are only elucidations of those commandments. I would leave the particular with proposing one question which the judicious reader will easily solve. Was Elijah a persecutor when he caused the law of God to be executed upon the prophets of Baal? Objection number 14. Quote, but the Constitution makes provision for its own amendment. If, therefore, you think it wrong, why don't you join and elect good representatives who may be instrumental in rectifying it? Unquote. Answer. A representative must swear to support the Constitution before he can take a seat in the Legislative Assembly. This oath we have already shown to be immoral, and such as we cannot, in good conscience, swear ourselves. What therefore we cannot do ourselves, on account of its immorality, we ought not to employ others to do for us. We are bound by the moral law and our covenant engagements to extirpate all heresy, blasphemy, and idolatry, as far as our influence can extend. We consider it not only unlawful, but also a very unlikely means to effect this desirable end, first to swear an oath which necessarily involves supporting them. Would not this be, quote, doing evil that good might come, unquote, of it, which the apostle pointedly condemns? Supposing we were certain that a reform in these evils would be obtained next day, nay, even the next hour, should we swear an unlawful oath to obtain it? We would be violating the command of the Most High, and incurring his severe displeasure. But farther, by our own solemn act and deed, we would tie up our hands from effecting the thing desired, unless we account the initiating oath unobligatory, and so mock God in taking it. Should a bill be brought into the House to make the Bible the supreme law of the land, would such a bill be constitutional? That it would not does not require proof. I am sworn to support the Constitution. How shall I behave? There is no alternative, but either to reject that law which is a transcript of the moral perfections of Jehovah, or commit perjury, unless I consider my oath to support the Constitution unobligatory, and thus mock God and impose upon society. Surely I ought not to put myself in any predicament in which I may be brought to the awful dilemma of either rejecting the Bible or committing perjury. Nor would it satisfy the conscience to sit silent and give no vote. This would be a silent acquiescence to the violation of the Constitution which I was sworn to support. Would silence be supporting it? Neither is it lawful for any Christian to put it out of his own power to speak in behalf of truth, when truth, or the Bible of God, comes to be spoken for or against.